A inovação tecnológica é uma facilitadora de engajamento. Através da possibilidade de se colocar uma voz audível a muitas pessoas, alguém pode se engajar e pode colocar o seu ideal, o seu intento ou o seu movimento em prática. Com a disseminação da tecnologia e o acesso mais fácil às mídias sociais, criar um relacionamento com o cliente se tornou algo muito mais presente. A partir daí, esse relacionamento permite um engajamento, ou seja, o cliente não é mais simplesmente aquele alvo que vai comprar mais de uma empresa ou de uma corporação. O cliente ele é um aliado, pode ser um aliado positivo ou um aliado negativo. E esse aliado vai disseminar a marca e vai fazer com que a mensagem ela se replique muito mais e numa velocidade muito maior. E para falar um pouco mais sobre isso, eu quero convidar ao palco um especialista em engajamento social criativo. Com vocês, Russell Stevens.
So my new friend Fernando spoke this morning about the inner world, and I'm going to talk to you guys about the outer world, and specifically as marketers, what it's like to think outside of a box in a world that's changed, and how to market in a social world. To start, let's actually start inside of the box with a model that many of us are familiar with. It's the traditional purchase funnel of some sort or another. And the idea being that you move people along the purchase funnel from awareness to consideration to preference and acquisition. You start by telling the brand story oftentimes with advertising and PR. And as you move down the line, the message becomes more granular and more digital over time until you get to acquisition. And while there's overlap between the various phases, by and large, it's a very linear, sequential process. And if I were to say anything about it and talk about a defining characteristic, it's that it's a very orderly process that we've all used in some way, shape, or form in the past. If that was then, this is now. And where there was once order, there's now chaos. You've got multiple channels, multiple devices that are cascading back and forth. You've got basically a purchase funnel that has been blown to bits by the explosion of social media and digital media. You have people not following the traditional process. They're using different media to get messages that you create in a very highly curated and mediated way, but they're also getting messages from and the information and sharing their information with peers in a very wild way. And really where this leaves us as marketers is you're not even sure what the goal is anymore. There actually are occasions when getting someone to share something or to tweet or to follow or to post is actually more valuable to you as a marketer than getting them to buy something, which leaves us as marketers feeling very overwhelmed because by our nature, we want to integrate all of this and coordinate into a nice, neat package. So what we do oftentimes is take what we can and leave the rest for another day. So what happened? Well, the world hasn't gone nuts, but it has gone social. And this is what I mean by the social world. You've got multiple devices, dozens of channels, online media, offline media, everywhere, all the time, at the same time. And again, you have a situation where your world has been sort of blown up in terms of trying to integrate all of this into a coherent package, right? You as marketers, this is the kind of thing that makes your hair hurt when you try to figure out a way to package this into a coordinated program for marketing. And what we do with this confusion, and oftentimes as an agency we're asked, the very simple question, the understandable question is, how do I use social media to market my brand or my product or my service? And actually what I would do instead, and what I like to do instead, is ask, what does it mean to market in a social world? And I can tell you what it doesn't mean is checking the boxes. That's the predictable result of asking the question, how do I use social media to market? We've all done it in our weakest moments, or at least we've thought about doing it in our weakest moments. You come up with an idea, You know, either your boss tells you from everything you've read in the marketing magazines and online that you're supposed to use social media to market your product now. So what you do is you come up with an idea, and usually late in the process, you sit around, maybe 2 or 3 people, and you think about ways to socialize the idea. So you post the videos to YouTube, you create a fan page, you tweet about it, you tell your boss, you cross it off the list, and you move on. But it's the classic mistake of thinking about media first and then backing up into the idea. And it leaves you with a nagging feeling that there's a lot more to be done with all of this than you're doing. So just to start to simplify this, and if there are 2 concepts that I think, if you take nothing else away from this today, that I'd like you to take away, that marketing in a social world means creating conversations that matter among people who matter. It's as simple as that. At least that's how we define social engagement. Creating conversations that matter, that otherwise wouldn't have happened among the people who you care about the most. And the next concept is thinking engagement and not media, or at least thinking engagement before you think about media. And what we call this, my agency, is the nice, neat package of creative social engagement, which is the idea of telling stories and creating programs and then delivering them by any means or media necessary in a very agnostic way. Now, how did we arrive here? Well, we have one person and one very, very famous person to thank for it, and that's President Obama, or specifically the 2008 Obama presidential campaign. And in 2008, the campaign realized that they did the math, and that to win the election, they had to actually get young voters to the polls to vote. The problem with that is that young voters for decades have been telling pollsters that they intend to vote. So you talk to them at the beginning, and they'll say, yes, I'm going to vote, and then they never get to the polls. And that gap has not been a gap that a campaign has ever closed, at least for decades in the United States, to the point where that most presidential campaigns actually ignored young voters between 18 and 34 and let other organizations try to mobilize them. So the campaign, the Obama campaign, actually realized that to mobilize people to actually vote, they needed to do something different. And what they did was they changed the rules. They looked away from the classic purchase or acquisition funnel and came up with a different set of rules to mobilize young voters in that campaign. And as a good example of this, what they did was they created conversations among young people that were meant to inflame their passions. So instead of creating posters and ads that said, vote for Barack Obama, they did things like created posters and ads using young artists that said, the reason why I'm registering is that I make 2 gallons of gas an hour, and I'm mad. And the whole idea was to inflame some of the passions that young people had about the issues of the day. The first rule in the new rules of engagement is exactly that, to find people's passion points, to say something to inflame them, and then you obviously need to make sure you believe it. It's difficult to talk to brands, especially brands like General Motors, Kraft, and tell them that they need to provoke their customers. So typically this is when I have the most explaining to do when I'm presenting this to my clients. The next rule is to connect. You've got to throw yourself into the debate. So even if you've gotten to the point where you've said something to inflame your consumers, you need to put yourself into the debate and continue to fuel it, drive relevance, become a vehicle for their self-expression. And then you need to use people as your media. This actually marketers like a lot because it tends to be a lot less expensive than spending a lot of money on television advertising, right? But if you can think about ways of using people as your media, empowering them as spokespeople, and rewarding them for sharing, it can be quite effective and cost efficient. And finally, you need to make it easy for them to participate. I'm going to talk a little bit about choreographing the spontaneity later, but ultimately it's all about letting people own the story, letting people own the success of your effort, giving a little bit of that ownership up to the people who help make it so. That was the genius of the Obama campaign. That's why young people went to vote. They actually got more young people to vote in that campaign than they ever had before. And they actually won 68%. The Obama campaign won 68% of those young voters, which was enough to put them over the top in some important local elections. So if the Obama campaign actually set the stage and wrote the book for the new rules of engagement, I actually don't think it's the best case of a social engagement program ever. And actually, my object from outside of the box is representative of what I believe is the best case. Hugo spoke about chips and silicon. I actually think that this is representative of the most successful social engagement program ever. This is a silicon gel wristband. It weighs about 5 or 10 grams. It's stamped with Livestrong. You wear it on your wrist, and if you were to judge the success of a social campaign or social media as the conversations that it creates that otherwise wouldn't have happened, I would argue that the yellow wristband was the most powerful social engagement campaign ever. And let me tell you why. In terms of what Livestrong did, in calling attention to cancer survivorship and raising awareness of cancer survivorship, in the past, in the United States at least, there was a tendency within the cancer industry to talk about people who had cancer as victims. That was not the case with the organization, and what it was doing is certainly not the case of Lance Armstrong's image. They positioned fighting cancer as a fight, and they actually started to tell the story of rebellion in this fight. When my agency, recommended putting Livestrong on the wristband, it immediately became a badge for self-expression. Really, what wearing that wristband was about, in addition to because it was cool and it was fashionable, or you supported Lance for a time, was that it told the world that you had a cancer story and that you were willing to share it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be wearing the band. And people started to share. They shared in the hundreds of millions. 80 million bands to date have been sold worldwide. And the number of conversations about cancer that otherwise wouldn't have happened, numbers certainly in the hundreds and hundreds of millions. And the genius of this campaign was how easy it actually was to participate. It was a meaningful personal action. It cost $1, you put it on your wrist, and then you talk to people about it. It was the simplest form of social networking that you can imagine in some ways. And it happened before there was social media. So the movement itself was this idea of banding together with people across the world that was fueled by a powerful story and technology and thinking outside of the box. It turns out, actually, we're in the middle of another movement that's being fueled by a very powerful story, by these new tools of engagement, and by a group of people who are thinking outside of the box about how to call attention to something. It's the Coney 2012 campaign that's being waged by an international advocacy group called Invisible Children, that's designed to raise awareness of a war criminal named Joseph Kony and to bring him to justice. So actually, if we could play the 1-minute video of this, then we'll talk a little bit about this architecture.
Around here, angry, furious at the loss of life here over the course of the past.
And it just does not seem that the violence that we've seen is coming to an end.
There is nowhere left to run.
Everything is now teed up for justice in the world in the way that has never been before.
He's the worst criminal in the world.
Abducts and kills and burns and rapes women and girls.
This makes him, I think, one of the most dangerous people in the world.
We have to make it the biggest story in the world.
You're my devil, you're my angel, you're my heaven, you're my...
We have no option but to stop the LRA. We need to do something even crazier to finish the job.
So the video, the half-an-hour video that this group created was viewed over 100 million times within about a week, 85 million times on YouTube alone. And it created quite a controversy. There are some other interesting pieces of this with respect to the organization and the founder. I actually don't want to talk about the substance, I want to talk about the process for a couple of minutes. So we could sit here and say, what happened? How did it follow the rules? I would ask you, what didn't happen? Because they did all of this, right? They found an issue, inflamed it, and then they poured gasoline on the fire. They got George Clooney, Rihanna, Taylor Swift, celebrities to adopt the issue and really speak out on behalf of the campaign and call for Kony to be stopped. They put themselves into the debate. They shared, they used people as their media. They came up with very, very inexpensive tools to spread the word, posters, bracelets that actually did have, unlike the yellow Livestrong bracelet, that actually had separate IDs for each. So you'd go online and you'd register yours and you were all of a sudden in the conversation. But more than anything else, what they did was they choreographed the spontaneity of that. That felt like it came out of nowhere. It felt like it just emerged. But the fact of the matter is that campaign was years in the making. So let's take a quick look at what we mean by this idea of choreographing the spontaneity. This was a very interesting piece of analysis that Social Flow, which is a social media analytics firm, created. It's actually a graph of the first 5,000 people to post to the Kony 2012 hashtag. Each dot is essentially a person, the lines are essentially followers, and the more red the graphic, the earlier in the process that person actually posted. And you can see a structure here. Again, these are the first 5,000. You see up top, Jason Russell was the head of Invisible Children. He had a lot to do with the initial blast of activity. You see the Invisible Children site itself in the middle. At dead center, you actually see Kristen Bell as an actress in the United States who picked this up very quickly. What's clear is that this was a pre-existing networked infrastructure that was used to launch this and trigger this campaign. But that's actually not the most interesting bit of analysis. Whoops, sorry about that. The most interesting bit of analysis is that there were even more densely connected early groups who took up this cause, and they actually happened to align with some geographic locations, and not where you might think, not in big cities, but you see Birmingham, Alabama, Dayton, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Oklahoma City. What the Invisible Children Foundation had done is they'd laid the groundwork on the ground by connecting with people, but they also laid it by creating relationships using social media that they triggered all at once in a highly choreographed way. So this wasn't just they put a half-an-hour video out there and they expected everyone to come see it. Everybody knows that doesn't work, or it works so rarely it's not to be tried, especially a half an hour long. The fact of the matter is they used young people, young children, young adults to spread the word, and they actually leveraged their enthusiasm to help raise awareness of this in a highly choreographed way. So, in short, and if I have the lessons to take away from this, it's to think engagement and then media, understand and tap into people's passions, fuel conversations that really matter. Even as a brand, even if you're a conservative brand, find something that matters to people and fuel it. Consider people as your best media, and it happens to be one of your least expensive forms of media. Choreograph the spontaneity. Don't just throw it out there expecting people will come. And finally, let them own it. Give a piece of the ownership up over your success as a marketer. Thank you very much.